Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get underway here in just one more minute. I think we got a few people filtering in from outside. My name is Kevin Dunn. I am the Public Outreach and Events Coordinator here at the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new to this school, we are a graduate institution of national security and international affairs dedicated to developing leaders with a sound understanding of international realities and the ethical conduct of statecraft based on knowledge and appreciation of our founding tradition in the United States. Today's event is going to be on the record, and connected to that point, I want to extend a special thanks and invitation to all our subsequent online viewers as well as the VFA representatives here today. Today's lecture is titled Erdogans New Ottoman Empire. Of course, the speaker will certainly be able to fill in the details from there, so I certainly don't want to proxy for anything past the title. I do want to introduce, however, our distinguished alumnus, Mr. Brandon Weichert, who's a former congressional staffer and the founder, of the Weichert Report. I highly suggest that you check it out online. His book on national security space policy is shortly forthcoming for publication. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from DePaul University and is a member of New College at Oxford University. He has been a contributor for numerous news sources and online media, including the Christian Science Monitor, the Dino Report, the BBC World News Update, and the Seth and Chris Show. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for coming out today to the Institute of World Politics. Brandon, sir, as always, it's an absolute pleasure to host you. Thank you.
How's everybody doing? Today we're going to be talking about Erdogan's potential new empire, Ottoman Empire. This is a little map I just decided to put up there of potentially where he hopes his influence will expand to from modern-day Turkey. The thing about Turkey that everyone has to remember is that Turkey's story begins where the Ottoman Empire's ended. At the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire, which was a predominantly Islamic empire, it ruled over the modern Middle East. It was a multinational, multi-ethnic polity. It sided with the Germans, the losing side of the First World War. It had limped on for at least a century as the quote-unquote sick man of Europe. The European powers were basically keeping it from collapsing because they didn't want to have to deal with what happens after it collapsed. But World War I was finally the end of that, keeping it together. And ultimately, between the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which between the British and the French, which created the modern borders of the Middle East, and then 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne, which created the modern Turkish borders, you saw the rise of a Turkish nationalist, illiberal democracy led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And Ataturk was a mid-level Ottoman imperial officer, but he wasn't exactly an orthodox Ottoman figure. He looked at the West and said, why were the Western powers besting the Ottomans? And he believed it was because of modernity, and he associated secularism, a form of democracy, with modernity, and he did not think the Ottomans possessed it anymore, and ultimately he believed that that lack of modernity led to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So he basically sought to replicate, to copy and paste, to use modern parlance, a modern democratic government onto Turkey. And former Secretary of State Dean Acheson described it as an imperfect democracy. I think Lord Patrick Kinross, who was one of his biographers, put it best when he said that Ataturk undertook to secure a profoundly liberal end using extremely illiberal means. He was rabidly secular. He oppressed Islam, oppressed all other ethnic minorities, subordinated them to the Turkish narrative, particularly the Kurds. They were not allowed to wear their traditional dress, speak the language. It was a very tough time to be and yet, though, Ataturk was trying to get what he perceived to be Turkey on the right path. This is the modern borders of Turkey. You'll see that it encompasses, for all you classical historians, it encompasses a territory used to be known as Anatolia. It borders Europe, it borders the Middle East, and it borders the Caucasus states as well. It sits on the Black Sea. It's a geostrategically vital state in the world. Under Ataturk and his successors, Ataturk ruled the country for 15 years. He passed on and left the country in the hands of basically a military junta. It was a succession of former military officers who led it until the 2002. When Ataturk led the country, because he was wedded to this secular vision of governance, he became an integral player in NATO. He comprised NATO's Southern Front. He was very much committed to preventing Soviet communism from expanding into the Middle East, at least en masse, and they were fairly successful at that. They were a critical member of the NATO alliance, absolutely critical, and they remain so, at least on paper today. These are some questions that have dogged Turkish politics since the 1920s. What is the role of Islam in politics? What is the role of ethnicity in the nation? What is the role of the state in the economy? And how will history influence Turkey's future? These are the kind of key questions that have continued to dominate Turkey's politics today. Ataturk was, for all intents and purposes, a revolutionary figure in that he was trying to transplant a very alien concept of Western-style governance onto a culturally not a Western country. So which explains why he was so violent at times and forceful, and his successors were as well, because they were basically trying to force-feed their form of democracy to the people there. In 2002, however, after decades of Kemalist rule, the secular Kemalists were basically corrupt. The government was bloated. It was not responsive to the people. Obviously, because of its oppression, it was highly unpopular with many people, which led to the rise of the Justice and Development Party. In 2002, it took power. AKP was a coalition party. It was bottoms up. It was a grassroots movement, and it was modernist Islamists, liberal reformers, and elements of other center-right parties. It aligned also with the Sufi Islam movement, of the Gulenist movement, led by Fethullah Gulen. And the Sufis are interesting in that they're considered heretics by both the major sides of Islam, Shiites and Sunnis, and they practice a form of mystical Islam. They pride themselves, particularly in the context of the Gulenist movement, they pride themselves on being morally upright. They really bought into the idea of anti-corruption campaigns. It explains why they were so heavily involved with trying to get members of this movement into the Justice Department of Turkey, into their police, national police services. They really wanted to go after the corruption. Almost immediately, Turkey sought entrance into the EU when the AKP took over. It's interesting because the AKP was a more counter-revolutionary movement. If Ataturk was revolutionary, trying to impart a very Western form of governance onto a country that was not initially Western. Recep Erdogan, who was the prime minister under the AKP initially, was trying to basically undo a lot of that. In 2003, Erdogan, to his credit, attempted to basically settle a long-standing dispute with Cyprus. Turkey had invaded Cyprus and at one point had up to 40,000 troops on a part of Cyprus, and it was a contested issue between Greece, the Cypriots, and Turkey, lasted for decades. In 2003, he tried to resolve it, and a group of Cypriot nationalists, Greek nationalists, scuttled it. Interestingly enough, Cyprus ended up getting accepted into the EU before Turkey did, and that complicated Turkey's accession into the EU. It should have been a cut and dry case, at least on paper, that Turkey would have gone into the European Union, but because of Cyprus, because of French and German antipathy toward Turkish admission into the EU on various grounds, basically, Turkey is no longer, they're still technically eligible for EU membership, but I think it's a mutual parting of ways between the two groups. One thing in particular that became very noticeable in 2007 was the divide between Turkey and Europe. By that point, Erdogan had begun instituting very Islamic reforms, allowing for public displays of Islam, which had been very seriously curbed under the Kemalist regime. He started allowing anything from allowing the headscarves again in public to banning the sale of alcohol in many AKP-controlled regions. It was not implementation of Sharia law, but it was definitely very different from what had happened the previous decades under the Kemalist rule. This also was happening as, for instance, France was banning the headscarf and taking a more stern approach to its relations with Islamic minorities in France. And this created a bit of a kerfuffle between Turkey and France when the EU High Commission on Human Rights upheld the 2007 French ban on headscarves. That kind of was the breaking point when the Turks at that point said we're no longer really seriously actively pursuing membership, and that sent the Turkey slowly down this alternate path to Western integration, or at least full-on Western integration. At its core, the Turkish foreign policy is dominated by answering the Kurdish question. In the southern part of the country exists a very large minority of Kurds, and the Kurds under the Kemalist regime were very much oppressed, as I noted earlier. But also, under Erdogan's regime and the AKP, they've also been very much repressed. The Kurds, since the 70s, have in Turkey sought their independence because they no longer believe that there was a proper role for them in Turkish society, since Turkey had been so seriously opposed to allowing any expression of Kurdish culture to be made in public. They formed the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which basically was a Marxist-Leninist separatist movement. And at that time during the Cold War, that was not the thing to do because it allowed for the Turkish government to brand them as terrorists. And to be fair, the PKK did engage in acts of terror. It also allowed or disallowed the PKK from getting Western support because in the context of the Cold War, any Marxist-Leninist movement was not one that the U.S. or its allies were apt to support. The important thing about the Kurds is that they don't just exist in southern Turkey. They exist in Syria, Iraq, Iran, Armenia, and they are the largest stateless group of people in the world. They are also very, for the most part, pro-Western, and they have been a very key ally of ours in the fight against ISIS, and then the Iraqi Kurds were also a key ally of ours in the fight against Saddam, both in Desert Storm and in 2003. This is Abdullah Öcalan. He is the leader of the PKK. He has been imprisoned since about 1984. Like Napoleon, he's kept in an island prison. I think it's very interesting. And he, the Turkish chant in the Kurdish chant in Turkey is "Without a leader, we cannot survive without our leader," which is Öcalan. The question of whether or not they're a terrorist organization or if they're freedom fighters, they're both. They've committed acts of terror for 30 years. Recently, they've really veered away from it and gone the political route. In 2013, again to his credit, the Erdogan government did make an armistice agreement with PKK. But by 2015, Erdogan abandoned this agreement and the violence resumed, the antipathy resumed, and it was all about the fact that the concern among Erdogan and his ministers was that they didn't want Kurdistan to be formed, an independent Kurdistan to be formed, because the fear would be cleaved out of southern Turkey, which of course would mean a reduction in Turkish territorial integrity, which is not good if you're trying to rebuild the Ottoman Empire. I thought it was interesting that on the 23rd of this month, the head of the DIA testified to some colleagues of mine on the Hill. I put it up here, that basically he thinks that Kurdish independence, at least in northern Iraq, is not a question of if, but when. We keep talking about fighting ISIS, and we need to. We are not asking ourselves what happens after ISIS falls, and it will. The Kurds, I believe, are going to declare independence, at least in Iraqi Kurdistan. At that point, that's going to, I believe, have a rippling effect for the region, and it is going to encourage both the Kurds in northern Syria and the Kurds in Turkey to begin agitating more seriously for some form of independence away from their home states of Syria and Turkey, respectively. This is going to have a serious negative implication for, at least as our foreign policy stands now. We rely on Turkey to keep the southern front of NATO, but how reliable they are because of the Kurdish question has become an issue. We needed Turkey to help fight ISIS. They've spent their time fighting mostly the Kurdish elements that are fighting ISIS also, because they're so worried about inspiring this separatist element within their population. Within their population, in between 2013 and 2015, when the armistice did occur, and this is another reason why Erdogan cracked down, the HDP was formed, which was a political party, mostly Kurdish, under the leader of Selahattin Demirtas, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation, but he was a very, very interesting young figure in Turkish politics, and he realized that the Kurds need to get a political front going. They can't just rely on the PKK, because the PKK has a very checkered history, and he was also very smart to realize that I need to create a coalition party, and so he, as Turkey went more Islamic in its political Islamization of politics, the HDP started building a coalition between the liberals in Turkey, between the homosexual community, many of the oppressed people in Turkey who are being marginalized by the ruling AKP party. And HDP had a huge success rate, which is one of the reasons why by 2015, Erdogan, who is not wanting to have to share power with another rival party, there has not been another rival party in Turkey since 2002. It's been almost exclusively the AKP. Erdogan, that's one of the reasons why he cracked down on them. In Syria, we are relying heavily on the Syrian Democratic Forces, the YPG, in our fight to retake Raqqa, which is the capital of the Islamic State. Part of that fight means we have to arm and equip and assist the YPG. Last week, the Pentagon announced that they would begin doing this in earnest in the build-up to the push to get ISIS out of Raqqa. The problem is the Turks have been very resistant because Turkish intelligence believes that the YPG is basically a front organization or closely aligned with the PKK in Turkey. And this is where the fear of losing Turkish sovereignty comes into question, because if the YPG is tightly linked with the PKK, the worry is that with advanced American weapons and with this new urge, this new taste of liberty, the Erdogan government is fearful that the YPG will not give up those arms after they take back Raqqa, and that basically they're going to pivot and try to get the PKK and help the PKK in Turkey in getting a full-on separatist movement going, using the Iraqi Kurdistan example as kind of a motivator, saying, hey, they're free in neighboring Iraq in the north. We want to replicate that, and we want to create a contiguous Kurdish state. And that is part of the reason for Erdogan's very tough crackdown. Another reason was the quote-unquote judicial coup attempt in 2008, basically the last vestiges of the Kemalists in the judiciary of Turkey launched an anti-corruption campaign against Erdogan and the AKP party. Of course, Erdogan says that it was a judicial coup. There is some evidence, as we've seen recently, to suggest that Erdogan and his party are actually quite corrupt. But there's no doubt that there was an element of trying to use the judiciary to remove Erdogan and his party from power. Erdogan turned to his Gulenist allies, and together the two of them basically took down the last remaining vestiges of the Kemalist influence in the judiciary. The Gulenists then replaced many of those Kemalists in the judiciary and national police forces, and also this removal of secular opposition created a significant imbalance in the Turkish political system that set the stage rather for recent developments in Turkey's politics. This has been an ongoing question. Is Turkey being ruled by a president, or is he being ruled by a sultan? And I've heard this quote years ago, and democracy is like a streetcar. You ride it until you arrive at your destination, and then you step off. That was what Erdogan said in 1996 when he was the mayor of Istanbul. And I think it's kind of a great snapshot of where Erdogan envisions his kind of final power state being, which is absolute power, which is more of a sultan. And this gets us now into the definition of neo-Ottomanism. At its basic element, neo-Ottomanism is simply Turkey reestablishing Turkish influence and control over the former Ottoman space. But you cannot divorce the political Islamist element to this whole calculation. It is, as I said, a counter-revolutionary force in Turkish society. So therefore, if Ataturk and his successors were secular, pro-Western, illiberal Democrats, by nature, the neo-Ottomanist push is going to do the opposite. It's going to be an illiberal democracy, but more on the Putin model and more on a not necessarily Western-friendly track. And forgive me, but the former Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu, I can never say this. I'm so sorry. I can never say his last name properly. I always get yelled at. But I think that this quote from 2010, he's no longer the Prime Minister as of last year. I think that his quote from 2010, this is right before the Arab Spring, was also very telling because he was Erdogan's right-hand man for many years. His quote that Turkey is a Muslim superpower that will have zero problems with neighbors, this mindset that because the former Ottoman space was ruled by a predominantly Sunni Muslim Turkish empire, the solution for peace in the Middle East is to allow for that kind of empire to return. It has infected the entire ruling party of Turkey, and I personally think that it is a grave mistaken belief because there are other parties in the Middle East who are not going to allow for Turks to basically rehabilitate the Ottoman sphere. And as we've seen, shortly after this statement, the Arab Spring happened, and all that they've had in Turkey is troubles with their borders. So it's kind of this, it was a very bad gamble on the part of the Erdogan regime. In keeping with the neo-Ottomanist push, Erdogan has been rebuilding lost symbols. I was reading an article about a year or two ago of a meeting between Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas and Erdogan, and I swear when I saw this picture from afar, I thought it was a pop-up ad, and I realized it was real, and I investigated what this was. Those are the old Ottoman Guard from old imperial times in Turkey, and the significance is that each one of those guards represents the 16 original states that comprise the original Ottoman Empire. There's little doubt, or at least there should be, that Erdogan is desperate, not unlike what Putin is doing in Russia with rehabilitating the Cossack military schools. Erdogan is desperate to reconnect his rule with the past as a form of justifying the illiberal extremes that he's taken to increasing and maintaining his power. As I noted earlier, you can't divorce Islam and neo-Ottomanism, at least political Islam. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here, but because Erdogan sees the neo-Ottomanist ideology as being closely tethered to Islam, he has decided to turn around and support Islamist movements as well as jihadist networks in Libya, in Syria. Al-Nusra was his primary client against Assad. Basically, Erdogan made a strategic calculation in the region that the future lies with those Islamist elements that have been kind of taking the lead anymore in the Arab Spring. Some are calling, I think Bill Kristol referred to it as the Islamist winter. But basically that he's taking a strategic gamble, saying that if I support these groups first, they will, when they eventually knock out these secular Democrats, or secular autocrats rather, that they will swear fealty to me the way that former leaders in the Middle East were paid homage to the Ottoman sultans of yesteryear. Again, I don't know if that's exactly accurate given ethnic divisions and the fact that I don't think Erdogan has the political juice to maintain that kind of power sphere. Again, this quote, keeping in touch with how Erdogan since 2010 has really embraced this kind of political Islamic foreign policy. The real question that I have when analyzing Erdogan, how serious is he about being as an Islamist? Does he really think he's Mullah Omar or the next Saladin or the next Sultan, or is he using Islam as a convenient tool for justifying his power grab at home? The question is whether or not he's the next Sultan, or is he just Frank Underwood from House of Cards, a Turkish version of that? And you look at the level of corruption that has kind of become endemic within the Erdogan ruling class and ruling party. And they had the gold for oil scandal, in which Erdogan was, and his government, in order to boost their economy and to avoid political fallout, they were giving gold to the Iranians as a means to allow for Iran to circumvent Western sanctions at that point. And in exchange, it boosted their exports up by $1 billion a year, which was just what the doctor ordered to help goose the Turkish economy along and avoid some kind of political backlash. It was during this period, though, that Erdogan's former allies in the Gulen movement, they were populating the judiciary and much of the national police, they began launching anti-corruption campaigns. Again, this was, I think, out of they were deeply pious to Sufism, and they really believed very fervently in this anti-corruption campaign. And they went after Erdogan, and they started back then going after Erdogan, his allies, as a means of unseating them because they didn't think that they were responsible actors any longer. Keeping with rehabilitating the image of the former Ottoman Empire, Erdogan built a 500 billion euro palace for himself. It is, I think, 4 or 5 times the size of the White. I mean, it is a monstrosity, and he really is trying to give the image that he is the Sultan, that he is the strong man, that he is going to lead Turkey to this new age of rehabilitating the empire and reasserting Turkish power. And this, as he justified it, because this became quite a contentious issue in Turkish politics. Many people were, in keeping with the anti-corruption movement, many people were saying, look at how he's misusing the public funds. His justification was, I need it. And it's good for Turkey because it gives the image that we are back. And I personally think it's architecturally not anything to look at, but nobody asked me. But he really does think that he is this strongman Sultan, neo-Sultan, that's going to bring peace to the Middle East and empower he and his political cronies. The reason I focus so heavily on the Gulenists is because last summer, this was kind of the last straw between the Kurdish separatist movements in the south and now the Gulenist movement. Erdogan suffered a coup. The former allies, led by Fethullah Gulen, and by the way, Fethullah Gulen lives in the Poconos in the U.S. He actually fled a few years back and made serious inroads with both political parties in the U.S. And he was seeking support from America to support his move to try to unseat Erdogan. But in summer of 2016, it was a quixotic coup attempt to unseat Erdogan. It failed miserably. It allowed for Erdogan to really crack down, and it set the stage for what happened a few months ago in Turkey, whereby Erdogan basically overthrew the parliamentarian system and established a quasi-unitary executive system with himself as president, inching his way ever so closer to absolute power. And it all stems from the fact that he had enemies that were trying to destroy him. That was, his justification. Now, I spoke with a former Turkish intelligence agent back in October of 2016 in McLean, and he was convinced. Now, he had fled the country. He was convinced, though, that there was undue Russian influence here. The 16 hours before the coup began, Alexander Dugin, who has been dubbed by Foreign Affairs as Putin's brain, was in the country. He gave a joint press conference with one of Erdogan's ministers. I don't really know why he was in the country, and he left right before the coup, as the coup actually went underway. He claims he was there just to give a lecture because he's an academic in Russia. I don't know. He tends to pop up right as things get hot. He was in Georgia right before the 2008 invasion. He was in Ukraine right before 2014 annexation. And what this former Turkish intelligence officer told me is that he was convinced that this was a kind of a false flag deal. I don't know. I don't have any proof one way or the other, but I did think it was interesting that Erdogan and Turkish intelligence always knew that this coup attempt was going to happen and that it did not have the juice to kind of actually accomplish what it wanted to do, which was overthrow Erdogan. But they let it happen anyway, and the Russians were, according to him, involved by propping up Erdogan and assisting him covertly as a means to solidify Erdogan's power. I don't know if that's true, but this was coming from a former Turkish intelligence officer, and I thought it was interesting enough to bring up. It certainly gives new perspective, especially considering the fact that Turkey is aligning ever so closer with Russia. Now, we've spoken about the Kurdish separatists driving Erdogan. We've spoken about Erdogan's natural urge to do a political Islamic counter-revolution. We've spoken about corruption and his urge to rehabilitate the Ottoman Empire. The entire time I researched this, I'm going, well, is this a case of the tail wagging the dog, though? Because really, we see that Erdogan, for all this control he has, there's still these people popping up trying to overthrow him. For all this control that he has, we still see the ceaseless flows of refugees coming in through Turkey's border with Syria. They can't stop it. They occasionally close the border, but they can't stop it. So I wonder, and the fact that he's aligned with so many Islamist and jihadist movements in the Middle East, I just wonder if he's taking the path of least resistance politically. His end goal is to increase Turkish influence, increase his power, and so he's just kind of aligning with what he thinks is the stronger horse in the region, which is this move to Islamism or jihadism, whatever you want to call it. And as I mentioned earlier, the real question is, I think he might be closer to a Turkish Frank Underwood. And this gets us to the Great Realignment that's going on within the region. Turkey being the kind of main power for NATO's southern front, the fact that they are getting so cozy with Russia is greatly worrying. Interoperability between Turkish forces and other NATO member forces, particularly in air defense technology, is at risk right now because Turkey wants to start switching out their NATO systems for the Russian-made S-400, which will complicate our ability to keep an interoperable NATO-wide defense system, air defense system. Also, the previous gold for oil scandal created a kind of back channel between Turkey and Iran. And they have maintained this. And Iran being a client state of Russia, there's this new alliance forming in the region between Russia, Turkey, and Iran over Syria, over a whole host of issues, over U.S. influence in the region. And this is a serious problem. This is a serious problem for U.S. foreign policy. Turkey is still a member of NATO, but how committed they are is another question, especially when they know that we are close with the Kurds. And again, for Turkey, the number one foreign policy concern, more than even reestablishing the Ottoman Empire, is maintaining the Kurds as part of their territory because they want that land. I wrote at my website, theWeichertReport.com, back in December about the great pipeline wars that are shaping up. And this is kind of a big deal for the U.S., or rather the Turkish position on Syria. As I mentioned earlier, Turkey was very much opposed to the secular autocrats of the Arab world. He opposed Gaddafi. He wanted to unseat Assad. That's why he was supporting al-Nusra. It's why he's been nominally supporting ISIS. Well, elements of his government have been giving money, been giving some arms. He's been bombing Kurds instead of ISIS. So he's been giving some nominal support to ISIS as well. Back in 2013, Qatar wanted to build a pipeline that connected Mideast natural resources, oil and gas, with Europe. This was a direct threat to Russia because Russia knows that Western Europe in particular completely relies on Russian natural gas, oil, and other resources. And it's almost an exclusive deal. In fact, it allows Russia a huge amount of leverage in times of crisis. For instance, during 2008's South Ossetia War, when they invaded Georgia, before the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, could actually get a response together, Putin called Sarkozy and Merkel up in France and Germany and said, hey, look, before America gets involved and responds, it's getting kind of cold in Europe, and you need our natural resources. And if you don't help us get a better deal and cut the Americans out, we're going to cut off your supplies of natural gas and oil, or we're going to charge you a lot more. And so, of course, Sarkozy rode in on his white horse and ended that conflict in Russia's favor. We now have a rump state of Georgia existing today, and South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and very complicated. And again, it happened again in Ukraine in 2014. Similar, he was using natural gas and oil and other resources as a strategic lever to pull against the Europeans in order to prevent American power from being fully brought to bear. This proposed pipeline would have complicated that ability. It was Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. It would have gone through Syria, and Turkey would have been the endpoint. When the Obama administration opted not to intervene in Syria in 2011, that killed the deal. Because the Sunni world knew, the Arab kingdoms knew, that the Gulf kingdoms knew that they were not going to be able to build this pipeline so long as a civil war was tearing apart Syria, because they needed to cut it through Syria, and they couldn't in such an unstable environment. Aha! Iran, though, comes in and says, well, we'll offer an alternate pipeline. We'll exclude Turkey and the Sunni kingdoms because they're allied with America, and it'll be Russia, it'll be through Iran, from Iraq through Iran, and it'll get the Mideast natural gas and energy sources to Europe, and it'll be us and Russia that'll benefit from this, which means the Russian position is upheld. Very quickly, Erdogan realized that with America not intervening, that the Qatari pipeline was dead, but he still wanted to benefit because, again, Turkish economy needs the transit fees. So he, in 2015, November of 2015, when the Russians were intervening in Syria militarily, he shot down a Russian fighter jet. Everybody assumed it was because natural Turkish-Russian antipathy. It was not. I believe it was because he was sending a signal to Russia saying, hey, buddy, the Americans may be out, but we're not going anywhere, and we want in on this deal. And, of course, now what we find is that Russia has cut Turkey into this deal, and now it is a Russian, Iranian, Turkish, Syrian alliance that's trying to come up with a peace deal to end the Syrian Civil War without America and the West's involvement. What's our solution to this? This is really it. The three big ones is we're going to need to figure out how to help resolve the Syrian Civil War. I realize that we should not want to intervene the way we did Iraq or Afghanistan. That should not be what we want to do. But we should be signaling to the Alawite ruling party in Syria, we will make a deal with you, but Assad has to go. But we understand that the Alawites are worried if Assad goes, that means they're going to get massacred by the majority Sunnis. We can figure out a way, and that's obviously not the purpose of this talk, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. We will find a way, though, to help bring stability, and we're going to have to work with the Russians and the Turks and the Iranians because they're there. Unless we're going to go to war with them, we're going to have to figure out a way to increase our holding in the region and then use from a position of strength a negotiated settlement. More importantly, we've got to defeat ISIS. Has to be defeated. As long as they're around, we're going to continue to have problems. What's dividing the Middle East is a Sunni Shiite Cold War, Civil War, whatever you want to call it. We've got to figure out a way to mitigate that. And then we're going to have to accept the fact that the Kurds are likely not going to accept being subordinated any longer to either Iran, Iraq, Syria, or Turkey, or even Armenia maybe. And so we might have to move back toward what former Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters suggested in 2006, which was to start trying to remake the map of the Middle East to comport closer with ethno-religious realities. The thing is about the Middle East, real quickly, before 2003, America was able to maintain a relative amount of stability because we relied on a balance of power scenario. After 2003, the removal of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, that balance of power was destroyed and allowed for an Iranian breakout of their containment that we had them in since the '79 revolution. This then created a militant reaction on the part of the majority Sunni kingdoms, and it's allowed for Russia's interference. It's created all kinds of problems. The most recent trip, I wrote an article at American Greatness, which is a new publication, about the Trump administration with its recent trip to the Middle East seems to be angling for some kind of revitalization of the balance of power that existed in the 90s. They're trying to create, it looks like, some kind of Sunni coalition that may involve Israel. But we're never going to be able to replicate that because of the Turkish problem. The problem is with Turkish ambitions on the part of Erdogan and also Kurdish separatism. So what I think we're going to probably need to do is look something more like this, whereby we allow or we support Kurdish independence, which will then allow us to recreate a northern front for this new balance of power agreement. We then also push back Turkey, which will then prevent any kind of interference from Turkey. It'll prevent it from being a serious problem. It will have implications for NATO, but as I argued in my last talk here, we're going to need to rewrite some of the things for NATO in terms of creating an Eastern European defense zone and a Nordic defense zone to keep Russia back. We're not going to be able to rely on Turkey as much, I don't believe. So this could be a potential solution, and I think that might be it. There was a quote. Yeah, this quote. This is the last bit I'll say. Turkey, because of Erdogan and his push hard toward Islamism, he is dividing the electorate. Even though a majority of people in Turkey are, they are Islamic, they're not necessarily in favor of very harsh Islamic rule or even an Islamic state per se that Erdogan's trying to create, or a strongman government. There's just enough to give Erdogan a majority, but it's a very slim majority. You have a lot of the Kurdish element. You have a lot of liberals. It's a mixed bag over there. So I think that Eric Edelman's most recent piece in the Weekly Standard, I think actually was probably one of the best pieces I've read recently on the future of Turkey. And for those who can't see it, I'll just read it. He said at the end of his article, Erdogan campaigned for a strengthened presidency on the grounds that he alone could provide stability for the country racked by terror attacks, post-coup jitters, and the blowback of Syrian conflict. Instead, he has thrown into relief the deep divisions of a society riven by ethnic, confessional, and cultural differences. If he pushes too hard and too fast to implement his post-Kemalist vision in the months ahead, he may simply succeed in bringing the country to the brink of civil war, and that would make what is happening next door in Syria seem like a Sunday picnic in the park. This is probably, I think, going to be closer to reality as time goes on over the next 5 to 7 years than any other alternative. I disbelieve Erdogan is going to be able to fulfill his ambition. I think he's alienated way too many people in Turkey. I think he's created way too many enemies. I think by pushing NATO and the West away, he may have gotten some short-term benefits with his new alliance with Russia, but that is not a natural alliance. It goes against every historical fact of the region, and I am very skeptical that this new alliance will have any long-term staying power, particularly as the centrifugal forces of Russia continue to play in domestic politics in Russia, and as we work with the Arabs and Israelis to put Iran back in its box. And here's my contact info as well. I'll leave it up for you guys. I run a website, the Weichert Report. I also write for a new publication, American Greatness. It is a domestic political. It is partisan. It's conservative. So I'm a Republican. But that is it. Full disclosure, and that is it. So I'm open to Q&As if anybody's got any. Yeah.
Thanks for coming. Very, very enlightening.
Thank you.
I'm Julian Kyle Lewis. I study international education policy at American University.
Excellent.
My question is about recent events here.
Mm-hmm.
The guards.
No, the attack. Yeah.
Very violent.
I think they thought they were back home for a little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
Describe the leader over in Turkey. The psychology thing was similar to the act. I was wondering, what should me and my class, how should we view that? Senator John McCain from Arizona recently said that the way that our government, the United States government, should respond is to have the ambassador from that country. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think doing what I talked about and allowing for Kurdish independence to occur, at least in some limited capacity, I think it will seriously complicate Turkey's ability to, or willingness to be more aggressive. Even though it was a minor incident, it symbolizes what's going on in Turkey today. So you want to throw out the ambassador. Unfortunately, we need Turkey right now. They are still part of NATO. We can't wash our hands of Turkey entirely. So, okay, you want to throw out the ambassador. I honestly think that there's nothing we can do about that because of geopolitical issues going on. And Erdogan he's a very sensitive guy, and we need him right now. And so pushing him too far, something like that could actually set him off and send him running really close to the Russians. So in the near term, I don't lodge formal protest, revoke the diplomatic immunity maybe of some of those people, but that to me is small chickens. I really think that even talking about something like this from official people in the U.S. will put Turkey on notice and might start making them a little bit more pliable or conducive to U.S. interests in the region, which is to end ISIS, roll back Iran, and try to create a modicum of balance of power to create stability in the region. So I'm more focused on the geopolitical. I don't really know in terms of something like that. I would lodge a formal protest or maybe have our Marines in the. I'm just kidding. No, replicate it when the president visits them. No, that's a joke. No, I there's nothing really we can do about that. This though will put them on notice. So, yeah. Yeah, I'm an alumnus. Nice to meet you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
Happening from what you've seen of the patterns of the past outline, there's a lot of tweaking type of person.
Yeah.
So do you think that there will be some lessons that have been learned by tweaking in quieting down all the opposition?
Sure.
Especially a few years back, trying to create so that it can be successful. And my second question is, some thinking that this would be probably a model for Turkey to export, especially in
The Putin model?
Asia, the Turkish model,
Oh, yeah.
to other, say, Arab or Islamic countries such as in North Africa and Middle East.
So your first question, he's certainly looking at Putin as a model. Yeah. It's a different context, though. In Turkey, you have a very large, the Kurdish. The reason I spent so much time on the Kurdish question is because they are probably one of the most powerful elements in Turkish politics. They're able to really threaten the stability of the Turkish regime, the Erdogan regime, I think far more than any other group in Russia is able to do to Putin. The Kurds are very well organized. They are incensed about how the Turkish military has been bombing their brethren in the Syrian Civil War. So he's certainly, you're right, he's certainly, I mean, that's why I mentioned Putin, is because he's certainly looking at the Putin model saying, I want to replicate that. But, you know, it's kind of like, I always liken it to kind of a facsimile. The more copies you make of a copy, it starts to degrade. And I just don't know how sustainable of a model that is. And also we have to remember that Erdogan, my sense is that, I don't know, I just think that he doesn't have as firm a grasp on power as he wants people to believe, or as Putin does in Russia. That's just my kind of intuition studying it, that a lot of this kind of big, you know, big palace and big this, I think it's because it illustrates a deep onset insecurity. And you look at the Gulenist movement, that was a nothing burger. But it was able to, even though it may have been a kind of exaggerated thing, it was able to seriously bring into question Erdogan's ability to govern the country. And furthermore, in 2011, when the Obama administration chose not to intervene in Syria, Obama basically told the Turks, it's on you, tag, you're it, figure it out. And Turkey, for all of this incredible power Erdogan wants you to believe he has, Turkey's only solution was, well, I can't do anything about it, so I'm just going to, can't beat him, join him. I'm going to support him. I'm going to, you know, lend dialectical credence to what the Islamists are saying. And so I think that's a symbol, which is why I kept questioning, is he more like Frank Underwood, where he's just kind of playing this part and kind of just doing whatever he has to stay in power? I think there's a deep weakness there, much more so even than Russia, Putin and Russia. That's just my take. And then your second question was the replication of the Turkish model in North Africa. You mean in terms of, how do you mean? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. That's the critical thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, the Arab nations do not want to be the Islamist
Yes.
identity.
Yes.
But want an alternative.
And also the ethnic division between Arab and Turkish. Yeah. I would say, look, if you're looking more for a better model, I would not say the Turkish model, the Erdogan model. I would say the Muslim Brotherhood model would be much, because they are overtly Sharia law for that part of the world. I think that's one of the reasons why, I mean, you look at Erdogan's vision of creating an Ottoman Empire. It doesn't have many takers in the Arab world. Sure, they'll take money, they'll take support, you know, because they need it in terms of the Islamist parties especially. But you look at the history of the Ottoman Empire, no matter how similar they were in terms of religion, Arabs looked at the Turks and said, you are a Turk and I am an Arab, and vice versa. And so I don't think the Erdogan model, I think that's part of the reason why I'm skeptical of his dream of building an Ottoman Empire. I don't think the Erdogan model is able to be replicated over the Arab world the way that maybe it once was, you know, in the old Ottoman Empire. And of course you have to remember, Turkey today is nothing like the Sultanate that existed in Ottoman times. It doesn't have that kind of staying power. It doesn't have that kind of moral authority. It just doesn't. So I hope I answered your question. Yes, sir. Yeah, the Peters map. Yeah, that one.
So you
Yeah.
were saying who's
I meant the international community. You know.
I just think it's an interesting take because you were talking about the decline of American military supremacy.
Sure.
But I think we're moving in a direction where it's very unlikely for states not to be expanding territories, especially with the conflict on there. So just curious, like, what your opinion would be on how, in the long run, maybe we don't need the nation state as a model in this part of the world because it clearly hasn't worked out.
Well, and so well, we're always going to have the nation state as a model because it's the Westphalian system. So, sure. Which is why I talked about, well, not me, not just me. There's other people that have talked about splitting the region along ethno-religious lines. You know, the Kurdish call for independence is not unreasonable, particularly how they've suffered in all of the countries that they're currently a part of. That, to me, you know, creating a Sunni state for Iraq is not unreasonable. I know that there are economic concerns. You know, creating an Arab Shia state is not unreasonable. Give people self-determination. You might have a better shot of some kind of mitigation of some of these conflicts, some of the suffering, some of the misery. So in terms of getting away from the nation-state model, in terms of it having the mixed polities, I think, yeah, in this region in particular, that might be a healthy idea to go along tribal or ethno-religious lines. Plus, that really allows, I think, for us to do some balance of power politicking in the region. You know, let the Sunnis stay together and let the Shiites stay together. Let the Kurds be together. Let the Israelis be together. And I mean, maybe it's simple, but that's kind of where my thought process was for the long term, because you're not going to stop a lot of these movements for separatism. And so the worst place would be to be on the wrong end of that. And what we're seeing throughout the world, and this is my website, WeichertReport.com, it was founded last year as a means of analyzing the kind of nationalist populist waves that are washing across the world today. And so what I look at is I go, there is, and I don't want to oversimplify, but there is kind of this movement away from big blocks, big political blocks among particularly people in regions like the Middle East, in the developing world, where they don't necessarily want to be part of an Iranian hegemony. They don't necessarily want to be a part of Ottoman Empire. They want to have their plot of land, and they want to, run it according to their desires, which is, I think, a totally reasonable, stance. Of course, I'm an academic, but.
Follow up. You understand that there's called illiberalism.
Yes.
But how does that counter American
Well, he's not our bastard. It's gotten me so far. So I'm going to stick with it. No, and I don't work for the government anymore, so I can say whatever I want now. He's not our bastard anymore. Erdogan has stopped being our guy. And what I'm looking at is saying, we can't bomb people into democracy. We tried that, didn't work. We can't back away and let the region burn. We tried that the last 8 years. It made things worse. So maybe something that does this, that disseminates or allows for power to be disseminated away from these far-off centers of power that may not share ideological or cultural values with the people being governed, and try to, get some of this going. It might actually mitigate our penchant to support autocrats. In the near term, though, unfortunately, I would say we're going to have to keep, at least for the next decade, backing. We don't have a choice. I mean, because the alternative is Islamist groups that are very well organized. I mean, the one thing I will say about the Arab Spring and the Obama administration's handling, which for the record, I thought was a disaster of the Obama administration's handling of it. But the one thing I will say is that it illustrated what happens when you do let the pieces fall as they may, as many have argued in the U.S. Look at Egypt. one of our stalwart allies, and I know Mubarak was not a good, I know that, I'm not making a moral case for him. What I'm saying, though, is in the coldest sense of American strategic interest, he did our bidding very well. And to be fair, there was a bit more of a moderation in Egypt under Mubarak and now under Sisi than there ever was under the few years the Muslim Brotherhood was running it. But look what happened. It wasn't that the Muslim Brotherhood was in Egypt. It was that they were the best organized, so that when the day came for votes, they were able to sweep. There were, I know for a fact, there were many liberal Democrats in Egypt especially that were dying to have a say in the future of their country, but they weren't organized. They didn't have the resources. The Muslim Brotherhood has been around since what? The 20s, 30s? I mean, they have been doing this for decades. So if I wish I could say let's abandon autocrats. I really do. I get it. Unfortunately, the alternative for American interests, and I think for human interests, is that we go from having autocracy, a secular autocracy, to religious totalitarianism, which is, I think Nixon said that he preferred a right-wing autocrat to a left-wing totalitarian any day, but of course it's Richard Nixon, so. But I think there might be some truth to that. Anyway, so I hope that answered. Yes, ma'am. Hi. Sure.
Supporting SDF in Syria, mainly composed of the YPG.
Yes.
And that is, something with Turkey terrorism.
Right.
So, how do you think the US can solve that problem regarding Turkey's relationship with Turkey? And my second question is, what kind of Syria does Erdogan want in?
What kind of Syria? So, yeah, so basically, and I've written pieces on this as well, basically what I'm thinking is, in a perfect world, we can fulfill the moral obligation of getting rid of Assad, but we make a deal with the Alawites, who are the ruling class in Syria. They're a minority of a minority. They are Shiite. They are a sect of Shiite Islam, but they are a minority within that. We make a deal with them saying, look, give us Assad, but we will help you come to a more equitable solution in the region where you will still retain power on a federal level, but maybe we can start disaggregating some of that power to some of the more Sunni and non-Alawite regions. Because remember, the Alawites did not want to be a part of Syria initially. Assad's grandfather actually was a leader of the Alawites, and he, in fact, did not want the Alawite section of Syria to be incorporated into the larger Syria when Syria was being created after World War I. So maybe there's some hope that we can influence things along that line. Of course, I don't know in terms of what will happen. I suspect, since the Russians and Iranians are so well entrenched, and we're only willing to go so far, understandably, that it's probably going to be something closer to what Russia and Iran wants, and something farther away from what we would like to see happen. To your first question, which was, I'm forgetting your first question. Yeah, so for the Syrian solution, that's the best thing I can think of right now. And I realize it's a work in progress, but this is all I can think of is try to keep the Alawites where they're placated and protected, but also give some of the power to some of the other groups in Syria. But also, so basically a cantonist approach, a cantonal approach to Syria. But in terms of the Kurdish coalition, we need the Kurds. They're the ones on the ground. They're the ones doing the heavy lifting. We have, since the 1990s, in Iraqi Kurdistan, we have been promising independence, some form of it. And we gave it to them when we created the enclave strategy in the 90s. We gave them a proto or quasi-state in the 90s with Operation Comfort and Hope, I believe, or Hope Comfort, I can't remember. But Jay Gardner was the CO of that operation. And it basically created modern Kurdistan in northern Iraq. There's kind of been a momentum, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, bipartisan for the last 25, 30 years, that this is what we're working toward, is an independent Kurdistan. And again, strategically speaking, to defeat ISIS, which is the #1 goal, it must be, in the region, we have to support the Kurds on the ground because they're the ones who are there doing the heavy lifting. And so basically Turkey's they're out of luck because they've not worked with us so far. They've been trying to hedge their bets. I understand why, but sorry, like there's no perfect solutions here. So we're going to have to deal with, which is why I think this is actually a good idea, because it'll limit Turkey's ability to really influence the region the way that they've had ability to, by pushing their borders back, by putting them on their heels a bit. Just the mere talk of this, and it needs to come from an official in the U.S. government, just the mere talk of this, though, might be enough to get Turkey on board. Look what happened last week when we announced that we were arming the YPG. Ultimately, I don't know what was said between Erdogan and President Trump, but ultimately Erdogan acquiesced a bit. Now, he's still griping about it, but he's letting it happen, the arming of the YPG for the final push into Raqqa. So there is some wiggle room, just the mere pressure from the U.S., which since 2011 has not been on Turkey, which is why they're kind of frittering around looking for another, strong partner in the region, which right now is Russia and Iran. So hopefully, maybe we can stabilize it on the cheap. This is a longer-term thing that is a little bit more expensive, both geopolitically and economically, but this might be what we have to do. But the status quo ante cannot reign any longer. So, yes, sir.
I'm John Leffler with the American.
Oh, nice to meet you, sir.
Can you address things, one about Christians here?
Sure. Yeah.
My larger question, Americans, we don't understand Turks give away their freedoms.
Right.
Election.
Yeah, you're right.
We don't really understand how can people just, one, change their constitution. Americans do not vote away.
Right. Right. That's why we had a civil war. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But how is it that people will vote for to give away that all the individual freedoms?
Well, that cuts to the cult of personality. That cuts to the fact that I think the most recent political experience for many Turks was the alternative of the Kemalist rule, which to them is not acceptable. And so it's kind of a binary choice. It's a false choice, to use the words of our former president. It's a false choice. I think there are a lot more options the Turkish people could be taking. I don't think there are. I don't know, honestly. I don't know. Because if I were in Turkey, I'd be saying, I actually don't think the Kurds are exactly wrong, because they actually, from 2013 to 2015, tried to do the right thing, follow the rules, create an opposition party, and build a coalition and do the democratic thing. Of course, that was ultimately pushed back. So I don't know. But to be fair, though, there are a lot of Turks who are not in favor. It's just they're not a majority. But it's a slim majority that Erdogan has. And the farther he goes down this neo-Ottomanist rabbit hole, the more alienation a lot of Turkish voters are experiencing, which is why you're seeing a lot of this. And your first question, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, toward that, yeah. So, the problem now is I know there was January, I think, the administration was floating the concept of doing kind of a repeat of what we did for the Kurds in Iraq, which is creating a no-fly zone. That was shot down metaphorically because of Russian air defense platforms now being active, the S-400, in the region. I think now that Russia has bought into the Syrian conflict, and the Iranians have as well, I think it's time for America to put the onus on them and say, look, you claim, Russia, you're the father of Orthodox Christianity. You claim that you're the last defender of Western civilization. He's not, but he's telling everybody he is. Okay, fine. Then we want to create an enclave for the Christians in Syria. You're not letting us. Why not? And start putting the pressure on them in the international diplomacy. And I do believe that Russia will ultimately cave because they don't want to be seen as something akin to the Soviet Empire. So. No, but you can create an enclave. There are, basically the distribution in Turkey, there are areas where there are majority Christians that you can start moving the other Christians, get them to go toward, say, and protect them, obviously. But the real impediment to doing anything to save them Before it was because the Obama administration just didn't want to get involved. Now it's because the Russians are there, and the Russians are saying no American, beyond what they're doing. No, they're really resisting us, which is unfortunate for the Christians and the people. Yes, ma'am.
Have you seen the relationship between Turkey and Israel evolving, and do you think Israel becomes allies there?
That is my hope, if it were to happen. Because in my view, if we're doing this balance of power scenario that I think the administration is trying to do with the Gulf kingdoms, there is a very quiet alliance forming between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And if, again, I am with the DIA chief. I think that it's a question of when, not if, for Kurdish independence. So if we're going to go along those logical lines, I think the logical end result is to say, look, Turkey's no longer reliable as a southern partner in NATO or as a northern point for the Middle East balance of power agreement that they're talking about. Free Kurdistan could. They are pro-Western, they are democratic. For the most part, they have a pretty well-trained military that just needs some training and funding. They are a contiguous region. Look at the map. I mean, that is roughly the area they would encompass. So they actually could end up being much more beneficial to the U.S. in terms of creating this new balance of power paradigm in the region. And so my hope is that, yeah, naturally they would have to align with Israel and the Sunni states to block Iran and also to check maybe some of the more Islamist urges of Turkey. Basically, the whole point is I think Turkey has acted irresponsibly. They are no longer trustworthy under Erdogan. Erdogan has made it so he's not going anywhere anytime soon. So we need to act decisively to ensure that the region doesn't suffer because of, tin pot dictator in a giant palace. So I hope that answers your question. Sorry, I forgot what I was going to say. I was going to say something else, but yeah.
Thanks for the great presentation.
Thank you so much.
And my question is, how resistant Russians would be to creation of the state of Kurdistan? Because that would mean that would become helpful with other.
Yeah.
For now, Russia has 5,000 troops
Mm-hmm.
in Armenia, defending the western border with Turkey. So with the creation of Kurdistan, there's not going to be a direct border with Turkey, which means there's no claim for Russia.
I know,
to remain in the
which is
region.
why I'm also supporting it. I'm sorry, keep going. I didn't mean to.
Yeah, so my question is that how resistant they would be.
They're going to be resistant, but I don't know how to say this. For all the talk about Russian military, this is the most advanced Russia's been militarily since the Cold War, but that isn't saying much. And yes, their nuclear arms are a problem, and their cyber warfare capabilities are a threat, but their ability to project power is only because Iran has been allowing predominantly the Russians to use Iranian air bases in Syria. I know Russia has 2 bases in Syria, I know that. But really the logistical bridge is made because of Iran. They're relying on a country like Iran, which will be contained. I'm convinced that we are going to contain Iran again, one way or the other. So in terms of the Kurds, yeah, Russia's going to gripe, and it might be nasty, particularly along the border, with Armenia. And this is not going to happen overnight, by the way, either. We're talking about northern Iraq first, but in my head, once that starts as a domino effect, it's going to start in Syria, it's going to go up to Turkey, and so in my view, this is kind of like over the next, years, but that's where it's going to, I think, roughly end. As time goes on, time is not on Russia's side. They will not be able to continue doing these military endeavors. In fact, most analysts were completely surprised that they've been able to maintain the far-reaching operations. In fact, remember, I think it was in December or January, they reduced their role initially in Syria as trying to bring stability to create a peace deal in Syria that didn't work out. So Russia's position in the region is not as great as they think. They're going to hoot and howl about it. I don't know how strong their reaction. It could, though. You're right. And this is the danger of partitions. This is the danger of, I don't pretend, but all I know is that looking at the trends going on in the region, the status quo will not hold. It would be nice if U.S. policymakers would stop reacting to events and start anticipating them. So I hope that answers it. Yes, sir.
Yes. The outplay of the other region, with everything that's going on, how, and China's a large player, so.
Sure, yeah.
China fall into something that is
Well, that is an excellent question because obviously they do not enjoy when we create new states because of the Taiwanese issue. I honestly think that China can be bought for now. Look at what's going on with North Korea. North Korea is, for all intents and purposes, China's little brother. And for the cost of some oil and natural gas deals, the Trump administration has managed to at least get China to step back from some of its vociferous support. So I think if you, and Eric wrote a great article at my website about the New Silk Road. China is very much wedded to globalization at a time when many aren't. And I think that if the Trump administration can offer some carrots, saying, I don't know what it would be, but in the region, they might be less inclined. Because at the end of the day, all they want is the resources. They don't care how they get it. Yeah, they don't want to empower America. They don't want to see America. But if you look at this plan, this is actually not empowering America. This is allowing America to reasonably step off a little bit and yet know that there will be at least a modicum of hope for stability in the region, which benefits everyone, particularly the Chinese, because of the creation of the New Silk Road. They need stability in these regions to have the kind of trade that they're ultimately praying for or hoping for. So I think the Chinese can be bought for now, basically. But who knows? You know. So I don't know if that helps you out with that.
a little bit. I'm kind of worried about the ethno-nationalism.
So am I. I mean, I'm not blind to it, but again, I like to think of it as I guess you're surfing, on the wave. You're not driving the boat. You're surfing. The whole point is to stay ahead of the wave. We have not been ahead of the wave. So if we're talking about this, and I hope that eventually actual people in the government start addressing this, and it sounds like the DIA finally, DIA is starting to address it, and Congress as well. My hope is that we can start riding the crest of the wave. It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be perfect. But again, that is better policymaking, in my view, than reacting. Because reacting does include nowadays the threat of nuclear terrorism. Everything's smaller now. Everything's more dangerous now. The margin for error is that tiny. And there's many more players involved than it was during the Cold War. So, disconcerting on that level. Yes, sir.
What happened to the Cyprus situation?
Yeah. So in January, some headway was made. Actually, there was a conference. The BBC reported on this. Nothing was resolved, of course. Tends to be how it goes. But they did make some headway, which is a big move considering how long that conflict has been. I think you're seeing a slow realization among all parties that the status quo in that condition will not stay. And Erdogan, to be fair to Erdogan, we saw it, however temporary, with the Kurds. We saw it in 2003 initially over Cyprus. Erdogan is open to trying to resolve some of these long-standing, and I think that speaks, by the way, to his actual weakness at home. He's really worried about overstretching his limited geopolitical capital. So I think that it's years down the road still, but I do think we are having some forward momentum, but it's open-ended, and obviously because it's the Greeks involved and it's Turkey, and this is an ethnic and historical thing, so it's not going to happen overnight. But I do think there was some in January, some headway, more so than, before almost in 2003 they almost had a deal. It's not like it's impossible. They almost kind of had it.
Modified charts, though, you don't really address it. To me, it's like the smallest dot on the map.
Yeah.
Knock that out.
Yeah.
Knock that out.
You're right. Well, that's why I brought it up in the beginning. But that to me is not. That to me is that, if anything, speaks more to the ability of NATO's southern front to maintain unity, more than it speaks to the larger issue of handling the Kurdish question of where Erdogan is trying to take Turkey and where Turkey ends up going. So, but that's why I brought it up, though, is because it. No, I know it is. Oh, I know, but. Sure. I mean, yeah, it was not the focus of my talk here, but you're right. It is. No, you're right, and that's why I brought it up. But there are bigger fish to fry, I think, in terms of our perspective, in terms of worrying about what the Russians are doing, worrying about European unity, such as it is. So, yeah, no, you're right, though. So, but they have made headway in just talking about coming up with a solution, which is more than what happened over the last, 30, 40 years. So, baby steps. But it is a lever he is going to play. You're right. There's no getting around that, though, and that's why I think that the more you might be able to push them back, the more on their heels they're going to be diplomatically, and the more pliant they will be to acting reasonably within the U.S.-led world order. So, thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you guys for giving me your time. It's been a pleasure.